Well, welcome to our session on disaster management, the Texas energy system. It's a little bit different than the other sessions. We're not talking about energy as a commodity and how to make money and where it's changing, although to a certain extent we are. But we're really looking at whether the system's ready for the next disaster. So let me introduce the panel. My name is Ed Salzberg, and I do two things. I run the Security and Sustainability Forum. It's a public interest organization. We convene experts from all over the world into free webinars on issues that impact society, from changes in weather patterns and natural disasters. If you go up on our website, ssfonline.org, you can sign up for free, see some great stuff on there. I get really true experts around the world into those sessions. And we're doing one on urban resilience starting on the 24th that I just want to call your attention to because it has a lot of relevance to what we're talking about today. I'm also an officer in a fairly large firm out of California that has an energy services capability, so that's one reason why I'm here as well. Kevin Strange is my connection back here, and Kevin is in I'm sorry, I've got Kevin, I've got Mike, I've got Sean, and I've got Sherry, so my age is showing here. So Sean Strange and I have intersected a couple of times in the past few years, and he's with the Texas General Land Office, and he's been there for a couple of years. He also has a very good sustainability background from DC, from working with community colleges and other places. But he's on the agenda because he's working on a competition, national competition, state competition for HUD where they're going to be distributing about $1 billion in resiliency dollars for state planning or statewide planning, community level planning. It's called the National Disaster Resilience Competition, and it's given him the opportunity to look into the assets within the state of Texas and with a plan in a way to kind of help pull those together. And as I'm going to talk for just 1 second, I have one slide to put up about resiliency. That resiliency is really a system of systems. You've got a lot to pull together here in order to make that work. Kevin Clement, I'm not going to call you Sean Clement, but Kevin Clement, serves as the strategic planner in the Texas Office of Homeland Security, and he wrote the Texas Critical Infrastructure Protection and Resiliency Plan, plus several other plans that accompany it. What's important there is that that's a way to communicate among different sectors within the state of Texas, the energy sector, other industrial sectors, the universities, the public, local governments, into much more of an integrated system to protect the state from whatever kind of disaster happens, whether it's man-made or natural. Professor Sherry Baim from Texas A&M has been teaching urban planning and environmental health planning systems for quite a while. She does research in disaster planning and management for health and human services, and she focuses on vulnerable populations. There's a system that she's really responsible for called 211, and it's a way to communicate into those vulnerable populations and a way to get them better protected. She's going to talk about how that fits into the system overall. You can have the energy grid really well protected, but that doesn't mean the people are protected. And so Sherry is really going to be talking about that. And then finally, Mike Leggett from ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, is going to be here too, because after all, we are talking about energy. And if we didn't have someone from ERCOT here, it'd be kind of hard to say we really are starting to understand how the energy system fits in here. And Mike is going to be talking about, in addition to the energy system itself, he's going to be talking about human resources and where some failures can happen there, because we need to pay attention to all parts of that system. So with that, let me just throw up one slide. And it's a slide that was developed by the Rockefeller Foundation. I'm really kind of fond of this one. And what this does show is this wheel shows that there are different systems that operate within a resilient program. There's community-based systems, there's statewide systems, but they all come together in a system of systems to protect a community. And there are health systems, transportation systems, and it's kind of like a balloon. If you grab one end and you're not careful, it's going to pop out in another end. So a resilient community is not one that has a system that's working. It has systems that are working together and are really integrated together. And the point I want to make is that energy is just one of those systems. So you can have a resilient energy system, but that doesn't mean the whole urban program is resilient. I heard yesterday a speaker say that there are three business legs for an energy utility model. One is resilience. One is reliability. One is economics, and one is green, and I think that's right. And he said only two of those work because the third, you can't maximize all three of them. You can maximize two out of the three. But I just want to argue that the fourth one is sustainability, and we need an energy system that not only can respond internally, but can respond with the rest of the system. And so what we want to talk about is how the energy system fits into this, to the overall resilience program for the state. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean, who's going to talk about what he's been doing in this area.
Thank you, Ed. With regards to the microphone, should I use one? Yes. Or yes? Okay, yes. Great. Hi. So, my name is Sean Strange. I'm the project manager on the Texas application for the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And if you have any interest in this competition and haven't heard of it yet, I do have a hashtag, TexasNDRC. There's some information on Twitter there that you can find our sort of overview or some of the tools we've been using to do this project. And so I'm just going to give you a brief introduction and then talk about what this project has yielded in the past 12 weeks. Hey. So there's a quote that, okay, I also got to let you all know, if I act a little giddy, it's because we just submitted the application about 2 hours ago, and it was a 12-week crash project, meaning that there was a lot going on. And so we just submitted 2 hours ago, so I'm a little happy about that. Now there's a quote at the beginning of our application which really captured the essence of what's happening in this competition and in Texas and has been happening over the past, generations of Texas. So I'm going to read it now. For all its enormous range of space, climate, and physical appearance, and for all the internal squabbles, contentions, and strivings, Texas has a tight cohesiveness, perhaps stronger than any other section of America. Rich, poor, panhandle, gulf, city, country, Texas is the obsession, the proper study, and the passionate possession of all Texans. So I read that, and I was like, wow, this is perfect. The author of that quote is John Steinbeck, who wrote it in Travels with Charlie in Search of America. So that's on the top of our first page of the application for Texas. The competition is a national competition, and it's being put on by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation. And it is for projects, allocations of $1 million to $500 million. And so the minimum amount that a project can receive is $1 million. And that's important because Texas, as you'll see in a moment, has 158 eligible counties, meaning that each county can have a project. And so Texas can receive $158 million if each county can meet the thresholds. So, science-based risk analysis, and that's why it's been great bringing all these leaders in technology and systems thinking to the table in this disaster resilience competition, because it's looking at the science-based local knowledge approach to risk analysis. Because HUD, Housing and Urban Development, has realized that their damage assessments in the case of a disaster are somewhat outdated, and so they're looking to uncover new approaches and ways to make damage assessments at the local level. And they're not only looking at new data resources for this, they're looking at resilient approaches to risk and resilient approaches to addressing vulnerable populations who might be affected by these risk factors. And this is sort of a huge paradigm shift with regards to disaster recovery. I've been working in it for about 2 years plus, CDBG money, it gets all technical and in the weeds, but we've not been able to do resilient projects in the history of the U.S. from this funding stream, which is the most flexible funding stream in the federal government, CDBG dollars. And the goal is, always with HUD dollars, and the Rockefeller Foundation, of course, is to help those vulnerable populations who might be adversely affected by a disaster. This is a map of the state of Texas and the counties that are eligible underneath this competition. The ones in yellow are wildfire. Those counties have been affected by wildfire. The blue are the storm, and the orangish color is the explosion in West. The city of West was eligible by FEMA, and they received funds, and so that has added an interesting component to this entire competition. The explosion, given the fact that post-traumatic stress disorder is a reality in the city of West now as a result of this disaster, and so it's opened new doors for resilient thinking, going to the local community level and looking at populations and communities, and not just infrastructure, but actually looking at disaster behavioral health. The target areas are the ones in red that have the little dots on top of them. In total, we've received 33 target areas for 33 counties across the state. So as you can see, the entire state of Texas is part of this competition. Willacy County in the southern portion of Texas is not in an eligible county. However, we're bringing them into a regional approach through our partnerships with Department of Public Safety and State Administrative Agency and COGS in general, which are councils of government. This is a drawing I did a while back. I had a friend do this for me. So you can actually read it. And this is, I'll try to compact this down due to time, but what has happened because of the National Disaster Resilience Competition is an approach called assemblage theory. It's a Deleuzian thing, and Manuel de Landa, one of my favorite theorists out there, writes about this pretty extensively. What we've done is we've activated the unexercised parts of an entity's capacity to interact, meaning that the people we have at the table here today are interacting. And that was the actual goal that HUD had put out, as well as the Rockefeller Foundation. It's a capacity building initiative, but the capacity that they're wanting to build is that capacity for interaction and uncovering of new technologies and approaches to disaster resilience. And so, again, I'll try not to go too deep into this. I do have a handout if anyone wants it, or you can email me and I'll send it to you. An entity has properties that are already sort of founded in it, and it's enumerated in a list of properties. It's their staff, it's their data, it's their reports. The secondary capacity to interact is what's been activated through the NDRC, and so what we are doing is this capacity has gone unexercised because people are not interfacing. A lot of times in government, especially, they're in silos, and they don't get the chance to communicate with other agencies. The same goes for the people who work there. They don't have the chance to share ideas. And so, as you go to the right, entity number 2, what you start to do is you start to be able to, through conversation, sharing of data, sharing of approaches, you then get to enumerate things that are happening. And those 5 bold in that entity 2, that third block to the right there, awareness, adaptability, diversity, integration, self-regulation. That is the Judith Rodin approach to an idea and concepts for resilience. In her book, it's called The Resilience Dividend. Judith Rodin is the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. That's what we're working towards. And if you all want to read her book, it just came out this year. It's pretty good. So then what we do is through systems thinking and looking at metrics and performance measures, we're able to bring them into a state action plan, and then in turn integrate that into the original entity's system. So that's what's happening. So we submitted today, and if you have any questions about phase 2, let me know.
Thank you. Congratulations, Sean. Don't get too caught up on the Texas Homeland Security. The office has 2 people in it, so it kind of puts it in perspective. Is this on? Yeah. What I wanted to cover briefly, I will not give you any pablum that Texas is where it needs to be as far as its management of critical infrastructure. However, in the last 2 years, we've made some significant strides. What I want to do is cover some of the initiatives, give you an idea of its relationship to the energy sector, where we're going. And I would say that the overriding theme throughout is we're trying to do away with what I call a traditional model of we're the government, we're here to help you, and we're here to tell you what you need to know, which it seems to be the biggest blockage to really establishing a strong public-private partnership. I can't tell you how many meetings or how many times I've heard somebody say that over coffee and donuts we exchange business cards, so now we have a public-private partnership. Hardly. The focus that we have is active listening on the part of the government, addressing operational concerns raised by the private sector through joint activity. And hopefully as I explain this further, you'll get that. The Texas Infrastructure Security and Resilience Plan was only signed into being October 1st of 2014. My wife thinks the guy that wrote it is absolutely brilliant, but we won't go to too much detail in that. What is important on this is it laid out a strategic framework for critical infrastructure management in the state for the next 5 years. This was a little bit of flying the airplane while we built it. It named Texas sector-specific agencies for the first time. And from the Texas sector-specific agencies, sought to appoint representatives to government coordinating councils at the national level. Texas had not been represented on government coordinating councils at the national level for critical infrastructure. Rhode Island was, Texas wasn't. Same thing was true on the private sector, where they have sector coordinating councils at the national level. We had no representation. We do that now through the Governor's Private Sector Advisory Council, trying to put people from associations, professional associations for a sector, and then if they're interested, we forward their name and nomination to the Department of Homeland Security for hopefully for appointment. So we're trying to get them involved in that degree. We espouse a Texas model for public-private partnership, and we do this through the establishment of sector working groups for each sector. So for instance, on the energy sector, an individual from the Public Utilities Commission representing the government side co-chairs a sector working group with a member of the private sector. In this case, we use an ERCOT representative. Also, the ERCOT representative brings in additional folks from the energy sector, and this speaking is the electric sector, okay? As does the government sector bring in additional government reps. We have polled colleges and universities throughout the state, and for those of you from UT, sorry, but I didn't want to get a UT Texas A&M focus as we so often get here. We wanted to spread it out through the state and get as many people involved as possible. The reason for that was we often overlook R&D. We wanted to make R&D a significant portion of the work group, so we brought them in. We're representing also the 3 traditional tribes that are recognized by the federal government in the state of Texas, as well as representatives from councils of government and UASIs. We also afford the utmost flexibility and the ability to bring in SMEs, subject matter experts. Jesus, drew a blank there. I'm getting senior here. Subject matter experts that can come from anywhere. If they have a need to bring in that expertise, they can do so. Okay, enough on the plan, I think. But just remember that's in our best mind's eye, that's where we're trying to get over the next 5 years. I will also tell you that there's an entire chapter dedicated to performance metrics, which it seems, as I went around and looked at what they had around the rest of the nation, seemed to be a huge gap. The Regional Disaster Resilience Action Plan I'm going to get to last. The resilience implementation process is a concept fostered or developed by Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory. I thought it had direct application to the state of Texas. So we got the Department of Homeland Security to buy off on a pilot project that we are currently going through here in Austin. We're halfway through for the city of Austin and Travis County. And the intent is to drill down on dependencies, interdependencies, cascading effects, sole points of vulnerability, and capture that data so that we can use it in other scenarios over time. We're trying to integrate a system called municipals, and I'll talk about Sherpa and Summit as we come up. But we do this through a series of workshops, bringing in the private sector, and then culminating in what we call a CALEX, a capabilities analysis exercise, which is a tabletop exercise that will be conducted here May 20th. The scenario we're using is a Metcalf replication. For those of you familiar with the attack on the Metcalf substation in California. We're doing something similar to that here in Austin, We wanted to knock the electricity sector out of the works so that we could specify and really drill down on the dependencies, interdependencies, and also its impact on communications. Okay? Now, with the resilience implementation process, we wanted to capture that data. And to do that, we're trying to introduce a system called Municipals that was developed by Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Municipals enables us not only to capture the data on interdependencies, but also through the use of Summit and Sherpa, be able to use that data on other scenarios. So this leads me to the Summit Sherpa. And I'm going to forget the acronym. I'll give it to you later on. Summit is essentially a platform developed by Sandia National Laboratories under the auspices of the Department of Homeland Security. In the past, the key points are it's free and it's easy to use. Once you're vetted, you can sign up, get on their website, and go through the modeling process with Summit and Sherpa from your home station, from your desk. Again, the ability, the fact that it's free and it's easy to use are key. Now, when we do this, up until now, if I did a hurricane modeling, I would have to learn how to use SLOSH, HurrEvac, advanced hydrological systems to do localized flooding. This puts it all together. Plus, it develops economic impacts that would occur, ties it to critical infrastructure. I really think it's reached the point now where we're bringing modeling into a point in time where it needs to be into the Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program, and the state needs to dedicate some full-time positions for modeling for two reasons. Not only to do the modeling, which benefits us in planning, benefits us in actual response, benefits us in the development of threat and hazard identification resilience assessments, and also in the development of recovery operations in the long run. I'm going to miss something on Sherpa, but I'll probably come back to you later on. I'm worried about time. The critical supply chain, I must have knocked this off. The critical supply chain resilience workshop is a new concept that we're focusing strictly on the oil and gas sector. Again, a DHS pilot. What we're trying to do is examine the entire supply chain from source to end user, which is very rarely done. Again, a lot of drilling down. And again, the operational focus here is to bring in private sector leaders, executive leadership from the different oil and gas sectors, corporations, and to identify with a pre-workshop survey what their concerns, what keeps them up at night, and where they prioritize them and how they think the government can assist. The best way I can describe this is a lesson in active learning for government representatives. We don't need a government representative to come in here and play DHS show and tell. This is not death by PowerPoint. It is to get in there, solicit their engagement, solicit their active participation, listen to what they have to say, record it, and then hopefully develop next steps to, once we've identified what their problems are and where they think we can assist, can we actually do that? And if we can take a private sector leader's concerns or issues and develop a solution to them through the government, then you have a public-private partnership. You won't have any problem getting him or her to return to the table to work with you in the future. I've covered Summit, I've covered the resilience implementation process, and actually the Regional Disaster Resilience Plan has come as a result of working with Sean. If we go around Texas and you ask an emergency manager or you ask a county judge or an elected leader, what is resilience? The answer is all over the map. If you ask them to tell you what resilience looks like, they struggle. And the intent here was to take a template developed by, or a template that we will develop that is really down to an Excel spreadsheet to make it simple for them to use, that uses the resilience disaster plan espoused by the Infrastructure Security Partnership, which is a nationwide association of people who have a vested interest in critical infrastructure, and then to coordinate that first with state agencies. So what we're trying to do is develop a holistic approach as far as what initiatives are coming out that would advance resilience in a region. We're also doing this with the Private Sector Advisory Council and members of the private sector so that they get their input on it. Once we have this information, then we staff it and coordinate it with the federal government, because what we're trying to do is maximize the use of federal resources, funds, and programs to advance these different initiatives. Then lastly, we get with the Texas Association of Regional Councils. We're soliciting the involvement of some very bright people who work as Homeland Security planners for the councils of government and the urban area security initiative cities. We get with them and again, fine-tune, get the esoteric language out of it, make it so people can clearly understand what we're trying to attain, and then present this to them as a template. So you're not paying $50,000 for some contractor to come in and give you a book that's 350 pages long that nobody's going to read. This becomes a living document tailored to your region where if you look at it, you can see a vision of what resilience should look like in your region either now or 10 years down the road. It also affords the regional leaders to adjust, and something we do very few times, although we talk a lot about it. We always say that you're supposed to put money in risk management toward where your primary risk is. Traditionally, what happens in state government is everybody gets a 15% cut in grants. Everybody gets a 15% cut. There isn't any allocation of funds to what's needed most. In this case, they can do that. We're not forcing them to do anything in specific. They are able to adjust and look for Homeland Security grant funding and emergency management grant funding based upon the needs, the capability gaps of their specific region. They prioritize it, they put those in, and they're not going to get everything done all at once. But if they can operate within the template we're giving them, 5-10 years down the road, they have a more resilient region. So with that, I think I've given you a quick overview, and I'll leave it to any questions you may have later.
My name's Sherry Bame. I drove a couple hours to get over here today from Texas A&M. I have been working with disaster-related research for a number of years, or I should say decades, in looking at community support systems and how people obtain the resources and who gets left out. In other words, the vulnerable populations. And what I almost by serendipity fell into was the issue of the N11 resources. 911, everybody is familiar with that in terms of emergency needs. And there are 3 responses that you get from that: fire, police, and ambulance. But what about everything else? What about the non-emergency needs? And that's where 211 has taken a foothold. Texas has a statewide 211. We are the only state in the U.S. that has a network of autonomous call centers. There are other states that are single call center for Nebraska, for Connecticut. But what ends up happening in Texas is, because we're so big, is we've divided by the COG regions and said, okay, let's look at our own resources, gather the information, and then mobilize them to the people in need. When disaster happens, the Texas 211 has a rollover capability to be able to take first call response, so that somebody evacuating from Corpus Christi may get their call answered by El Paso 211 with the same set of resources that exist in Corpus or anywhere along their evacuation route. This system was officially certified by the FCC in 2000, and it's still evolving. The number of roles that 211s have taken across the nation during disasters have varied widely. Most recently, the significant role in New York with Hurricane Sandy. We've not had a major occurrence except for West response and the wildfires since 2008 with the 5 hurricanes that happened then. So what we see with the 211 call center is an opportunity, almost a gold mine of data to be able to identify unmet needs across a population. If a person knows what you need and you know where to go for it, you go and you get your needs met. Many after-action reports of number of shelter beds used, number of meals served, number of people transported, et cetera, identifies needs. We have these well-known with a number of resources. But what we don't have is what about those people with access barriers to get their resources? And what we see is when they encounter an access barrier, we now can have a communication hub with the 211 number, with the 211 service. It essentially enables a easy-to-remember 3-digit number with a wealth of activities and resources and technology behind it in order to respond to normal everyday community needs as well as disaster needs. Homeland Security funded me in 2008 to take a look at the Texas response to Katrina Rita, given that a number of Katrina evacuees came through Texas, came to Texas, and were dispersed when Rita approached as well. What were the needs? And we did this as a template to say, here's the capability of these data. Let's look at what can be done. We can monitor them daily. You can actually have the capability of monitoring them by minute. But the point is we can monitor over time and identify, I don't see a pointer on here, and identify where the peaks are. You see a weekly pattern here. Even though it's a 24/7 service, the resources aren't available 24/7. So often people just wait on a need-to-know basis and then we'll call on a Monday through Friday more often. And you see that these patterns of unmet needs vary according to time during and phase during a disaster. This is no surprise, but the issue is, imagine the capability of monitoring unmet needs in real time through a feed interfacing with the emergency operations centers, with the utility response teams, with any of the emergency and disaster services. And we can monitor by location. I've included only 4 basic needs in terms of food, health, housing, and transportation. And again, you see a different pattern according to different types of needs. But what we saw initially when you just monitor volume, obviously the more people in an area, the bigger the volume of unmet needs. So the population triangle in Texas consistently shows you need to send more resources, but at the same time, what's their risk? We know there's more people, we know we need more resources, but are there any surprises in terms of areas once you control for urban-rural bias, once you control for population size? And the bottom set of 4 shows that remarkable difference in hotspots where counties were not able to mobilize resources. They received evacuees. They were stressed with their own community needs as well as additional evacuee needs and were not able to respond in an adequate way. And you see different patterns of hotspots according to the type of need. One can even drill down further within a need and say, okay, what's the pattern over time? Here's an example of transportation over time, and I didn't have enough capability to actually make a video of this, but that potential is there within the database to actually track these things in real time. Where are people running into access barriers, and therefore where should we mobilize resources for the most vulnerable populations? A couple instances that I want to mention, you can even drill down within this. For instance, within the housing unmet need, as one of the categories, we have been looking at differences between homeowners and renters and what their different types of needs. One can look at utility needs in regard to affordability for utility needs, service, when their service is out during the disaster, when it comes back up, everybody knows that. But what are the remnants of unmet needs once that service has been brought back online? I want to mention my experience in working with New York City 211 and San Diego 211s. They have really done a remarkable job of outreach and innovation into their communities. The San Diego process, and I don't know how many of you are actually from utility companies. Some, about half. What the San Diego 211 did was contract with their utility company to say, we are going to be the interface with the grassroots caller when they spot a down line. San Diego, obviously, Southern California in general, has a wildfire problem, and down utility lines became a very big deal in that, since they are held liable for damages if it comes from the utility line. And so they used 211 as a call center to report down utility lines. How easy is that in terms of then targeting where that household is, targeting where that site is, in almost immediate spotting, because it's the people out there in the neighborhoods or people going across a field that see it first. Okay. And then New York City, let me finish up here. New York City had hooked up their 211 system to do a direct interface with the actual service delivery organizations. And we are talking, hopefully, with this funding, that we could interface directly with FEMA, directly with other providers, that 211 could do the intake and then immediately release it into the agency and move forward.
Thank you very much. Hold on. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Leggett. I'm ERCOT's Human Factors Engineer. And so let's talk a little bit about the bulk power system, or the grid. So PPD 21 says that of all of the critical infrastructure sectors out there, energy and communications, and by the way, communications obviously is a critical part of energy, is one of the most universally critical systems, simply by the fact that all of the other critical infrastructure sectors are directly enabled by the energy sector. And similarly, DOE has identified a resilient grid as one of, if not the top priority for our society. So let me kind of take this and tell you a personal story. So back in 2003, like many graduate students, I was doing a ton of laundry. I was living in New York, and my wife was working down near Times Square. And as I put the last quarter in, I think it was the 5th dryer, because again, I was a grad student, something funny happened. And of course, I thought I blew out a circuit breaker, but it turned out to be a lot more than that. Now, being a ham radio operator, I quickly was in the Emergency Operations Center for where I was living at the time, Westchester County, and we saw firsthand what happens when the lights go out. You would find ambulance drivers who could talk by radio to their dispatcher, but their dispatcher couldn't talk to any of the hospitals. And it became clear very quickly that all of these relationships, this communication, is so critical, and energy supplied the kind of glue to bring that all together. And as a psychologist, the reason I got into this field was because it became clear that ultimately we had a human problem, which was a loss of situation awareness. So at ERCOT, a lot of what I do is focused on the interface between human beings and the grid that they maintain. So for example, this tool Macomber map, which we built, pulls together information from a variety of systems in order to create not what the engineer built, not what the systems designer or database designer architected, but what the human being who is making the actual decision, the control room operator, needs to see. It integrates all that information to support situation awareness. Now, what do we know about human beings? Because the point I would like to kind of highlight more than anything else is that while we have advanced devices from Internet of Things connected thermostats up to synchrophasers, that the most critical piece on the bulk power system is actually the human being. It has been, it will always be that way. And so my job is to focus on how do we take the same principles, we take what physics gives us and we turn it as engineers into building, all of the equipment and ensuring that the grid works within its reliable tolerances. And we take engineering, take the lessons from physics to do that. So why not do the same with psychology as it relates to the human being? So what we know, for example, is that people have predictable ways of making mistakes. And so we look at, for example, our operators are highly skilled, and so we need to make sure that our big risk, which is inattention, gets addressed. It also turns out that the way that we make decisions has a lot to do with our stress level. If our stress levels are too low, we may not pay good attention, which means our memory is impaired. If our stress is too high, we're likely to make knee-jerk decisions to get out of the stress as quickly as possible. So how do we help optimize the human system for that? And how do we understand that human beings, all of you right now are sitting here. It's late in the day, you probably had some good carbs with your lunch, you're all tired. And so what you're doing is you're actually forcing yourselves to sit in this chair and not close your eyes and take a nap, for which I thank you. But ultimately, that self-control is a limited resource. And so what we know is that when human beings force themselves to sit there, at some point we exhaust that resource. Now, in a real disaster situation, one of the biggest challenges is that sometimes you're just supposed to sit there and watch the system and maintain situation awareness for a prolonged period of time, and there's nothing you can do because someone else is doing the important thing. How do we deal with that? There's a lot of human performance factors we have to consider in high-stress situations. And we have to build our systems, we have to build resilience at the human level to build resilience at the grid level. So we really have to focus on what's important, because it's very simple to write a procedure. It's very simple to have legal come out and say, thou shalt do this or thou shalt not do that. But the problem is we have to look at what our end goal is and ensure that we've set up our human beings for success. I don't know if you can see it out in the back, but at the bottom of that sign, it says, also the bridge is out ahead. So, yeah, I figured some of you may have similar vision to me. And so ultimately, resilience in the grid starts with resilience engineering, which is a subfield of human factors engineering, which looks at how do we optimize the human beings in their situation, in their environment, to set them up for success. And we can learn a lot, for example, looking at aviation. Early on, we knew that there was a problem with pilots basically taking these multi-million-dollar machines and taking off and crashing because of these complicated systems. And even in our recent memory, this chart below is showing you fatal accidents in airline flights and number of scheduled departures. So as you see, we're getting more and more and more flights going with fewer and fewer and fewer casualties, except there's one very strange blip happening in the late 80s. What that was the autopilot. So it turns out that back then, early autopilots were basically a box with a light that said on and a switch that said on and off, and that was it. So the way an autopilot works is it takes care of everything for you as long as the system is operating within its tolerance range. But the second the system operates out of that tolerance range, the autopilot shuts off. Well, back then, when all you had was a little indicator light, the phrase they would use in aviation was that the pilot had either 11 seconds or the rest of their life to figure out what was going on. So ultimately, the reason that we've got that number spiking down and continually now to virtually zero is because we're looking more and more. We've built those systems are strong, and now we're building those human systems to be equally strong. When Sully was interviewed about how he managed to land the plane in the Hudson, he said, it's simple. I've done it before. He hadn't actually landed a plane before, but in simulation, that's exactly what he did. And so that's why bringing all of the people, all of the operators in Texas together, doing shared simulations, shared exercises, shared work, shared discussions, lessons learned, and so forth, is such a critical part. So ultimately, you know, I've been asked, am I worried about the next big problem? And my answer is that I'm able to personally sleep well because we have these amazing human beings in our control room and throughout the control rooms in the Texas region. And so that's my best answer. So yes, I do think we'll be good. Thanks.
Mike, thank you. That was a nice way to end this session. Let's just pull these chairs, this part of the session anyway, pull these chairs together because we need to stay on TV. Great. Okay. That's good right there. We're good? So I'd like to just start out with one question that's been on my mind, and this is really kind of a question for you, Mike, over to Kevin in a way. I really like the human resource aspect of this, but it also sounds like the Department of Homeland Security is initiating programs to pull in the other stakeholders in the whole resilience system, vulnerable populations as well, I'm assuming. But what is it that you want to tell the Department of Homeland Security that the energy system really needs to communicate into that system to really protect it and also make sure it's part of that overall resilience system for the whole community?
Sure. Well, thank you very much. If I can kind of extend the answer beyond just DHS, but including it to the general population. I mean, ultimately, we live in a world where most of the things that we do are on limited bandwidth pipes. Energy travels over lines that can only carry so much. Internet bandwidth can only go so far. Natural gas lines can only carry so much, and so forth. And so to me, the view that I would have is that it's a kind of shared collaborative process between all parties kind of involved to make sure that the system stays secure. So it's transparent communication, it's involvement, and I think, you know, when I was a kid, I always used to think it was magical, you know, you just flip the light switch and magic happens. And, you know, the more I become an engineer and study all the magic that goes beyond it, it's even more magical. But I think there's kind of that sense that we are all, you know, Facebook is not the first thing that made us feel like we're part of a bigger global community. Every time we've made an energy decision for our entire lives, we've been a part of an energy community. And so I think that extending the resilience, not just from the people who are managing, but also from all of the people who are participating, and creating a dialogue that continues not just during some, you know, theoretical problem, but also all the time.
And so, Kevin, sort of responding back to that, how do you view that kind of integration of, say, what Mike is saying in terms of it's not just the people at the energy stations, but it's the whole community that has to be part of this dialogue?
I certainly, while you were talking, I was thinking about a comment made by, go ahead, sir.
Okay. Yeah, so we were going to just ask this one question, and then we're going to move to Q&A. So we were hoping to be done on time at 3:30.
I see your whole community, although I think that term gets overused. There was a comment made by a guy by the name of Joe Piccioni, who runs critical infrastructure for the state of New Jersey. And in his comment, he was talking about the difficulties they ran into right after Hurricane Sandy, where he said that for the first 72 hours, the government was trying to get fuel reestablished, get stores back on, get energy running again. And he said what happened at that time was the leaders from the private sector brought the state leadership into a room, basically shut the door and said, look, y'all don't do this for a living, we do. And don't tell us how to pump gas, that's what we do. Don't tell us how to do groceries, that's what we do. And I think the same thing is, you know, true on the energy sector. You've got to reach out and actively solicit the involvement of the community, the involvement of the private sector leadership in reaching joint agreement and joint initiatives to really increase the resilience. After 23 years of being an Army officer, one of the things I really came across was that no one expects you to be expert in any one particular area, but they do expect you to find out who is expert, to solicit their advice, their expertise, and to use that in reaching the decisions or solutions to different issues that come up. So I think that holds over. That's why you saw the recurring theme that I mentioned of soliciting the private sector partnerships, although partnership itself may be overused, soliciting their expertise, soliciting their involvement, not just of the corporations, the professional associations, the trade organizations, and the individual subject matter experts as they come along.
Good response. Let's open it up to the floor. We have about 8 minutes, so if there are people that do have some questions, and let me do this. Let me just pass the microphone up, and if you could just pass it over to the next questioner after this.
Thank you so much, and I apologize for being so disruptive. What you presented is dear to my heart, and I'm Masood Amin. Post 9/11, I directed all the security R&D for our nation's utilities at Zpryme. And we did a comprehensive, I'm not going to go into details because it becomes very sensitive, classified fast. We did assessment of vulnerabilities, mostly for the Western Grid, ERCOT, and Eastern Interconnection. But that was 14 years ago. And we knew exactly what the weak areas are. We could even highlight what to do to protect it. We did that in October, November of 2001, right after the tragedies. And the 2003 blackout originated in the same exact corridor that we had predicted. So what you're doing, tools that have gotten a lot more sophisticated can help a lot in it. We cannot talk about a lot of that in the public domain, but do you know if that work as part of ERCOT or partnership with DHS under the new presidential directive on sharing the information is still going? Because that's a huge source of concern. And how, if an attack happens or if a natural disaster occurs, how do you keep the lights on? Sorry for interruption again, because I'm on another panel in a few minutes.
Okay, so one of the easiest ways to get myself in trouble is say more than I know. What I do know at a very high level is that as far as the relationships go with state government agencies and so forth, those dialogues are happening. Being a ham radio operator myself, I know that we're thinking a lot about communications across all layers and so forth. So there's definitely a lot of those conversations happening. I think you ask anybody, given more time, more support, you would always want more. There's always more we could do. But I definitely, the best news I can give is I think people get it. So.
I'll also say the threat changes. You mentioned 14 years ago. I'll point out, and some of you may have read this, last week, the Washington Examiner highlighted comments made by the Iranians as far as advocating the use of an EMP or nuclear weapon to do so in the United States. We've heard these threats for quite a long time from North Korea. What changes the mix, and again, this is not classified, this appeared in headlines in the Pacific, is that North Korea is now believed to have the ability to miniaturize a nuclear weapon. If you can miniaturize a nuclear weapon and North Korea flies a weather satellite, it's a weather satellite that flies over the middle of the United States and the East Coast at optimally the right altitude to detonate a nuclear weapon that would have an HEMP impact on the United States and in effect knocking out our electrical grid. That threat was not present, obviously, 14 years ago. And that's the kind of stuff that keeps me awake at night. I'm glad you looked that far in the future, truthfully. If we learned anything from the planes flying into buildings and into the Pentagon, is that we need to think outside the box is what the approach threats can make.
Is there another question?
I'll just point out for the benefit of those who have to travel north to Dallas, we have had an infrastructure failure. The I-35 bridge was laid up and collapsed. So resilience means you're going to have to find a good view for it.
Yeah,
Was anyone in this? Was it?
30 minutes ago.
I hope everyone was all right. Well, I think also this unfortunately highlights, one of the most important parts of resilience, which is that, I can build a perfectly resilient server, 5,000 feet underground in concrete with a good battery. That doesn't mean that the overall system is. When you have so many different things are tied together, like, for example, the time that you have a predictable frequency drop across the entire United States, the one time of year that that happens in a synchronized fashion is halftime at the Super Bowl, because everybody flushes their toilet at about the same time. All of the reservoirs kick in, which of course those are electric pumped. And similarly, you have natural gas powering plants at the same time that you have electric compressors of natural gas helping to make that happen. And obviously in this kind of situation, if you have, for example, utility workers going to repair a site with a bridge that's non-functional, you have to start, you start moving from the individual system to the system of systems and looking at those kind of interactions.
Familiar with the project that PSE&G did in New Jersey, where they installed something like 200,000 one single panel solar and panels on the utility poles, like every fourth pole, to be able to detect between sensors where a grid failure was. They did that as part of a project with the DOE, and I was recently indoors in New Jersey, and it's just driving, you see them.
Yeah.
And that way, the minute there's a grid failure, they can be dispatching, trucks to fix that before, they can pinpoint it down to within 4 telephone poles of where that failure is. Are you familiar with that project? Does Texas ever entertain anything on that scale? Because they said the responsiveness and the ability to bring the grid back up and start billing all those customers quickly, had a payback of like under a year to install that system.
That's incredible. I'm honestly not surprised. ERCOT doesn't own any infrastructure. It would really have to be the, for example, the transmission providers or the distribution providers who would do that to protect their assets. But ultimately, I think that's where a lot of these intelligent devices are moving, is that we're going to see much more deep, real-time, and long kind of data around that.
And thank you. And also in that same vein, the competition CDBG funds would most likely be eligible, or that activity would be eligible to be funded, is what it sounds like with what you're saying. With the CDBG, NDRC competition funds. So if a local community has an issue like that, or they want to address something like that, there's a high likelihood that that could be funded underneath this funding stream. And that's why it's such a revolutionary thing, where before it's building back to where the infrastructure was before the storm, and now they're opening up a stream for build back to where it was before the storm, but now think about these other innovations and new technologies that can also be funded as part of this new initiative at the nationwide level. So I'd like to learn more about that too, if
Just put the solar power poles, PSEG as a good way, bring up.
Any other questions? I have one quick one for Sherry. Just thinking about vulnerable populations in a really major event like a hurricane, and you've got vulnerable populations that don't have the resources to do things like get out of Dodge at the right time in order to do that. Are there some things that you would say might really be built into the energy system in order to address situations like that? Maybe this is out of right field, but given that experience that you've had already with the 211 and focusing on these populations.
Well, It's a matter then of plans regarding sheltering in place and looking at that kind of resiliency for people who can't get out. But again, with the 211 acting as the communication hub for special needs populations who physically can't get out, they use that as a trigger of people to go pick them up. I don't want to run over time.
Any final comments anyone would like to make before we let people go on to the next session? If not, thank you very much for participating, and thank you all for coming.